You are not arriving early, and you are not arriving late. The moment this registers is the same moment it can be registered. Nothing is being delivered ahead of readiness. Nothing is being withheld. What you notice now is not urgency calling for action. It is recognition settling into place, like a signal that only becomes audible when the system is quiet enough to receive it. There is a subtle easing already happening in you, not because something has been fixed, but because something has stopped pushing. The constant pressure to move, to decide, to resolve, has loosened just enough for you to feel the space beneath it. That space was always here. It did not need to be created. It only needed interference to reduce. Your attention may still drift. Thoughts may still appear. That is not a problem. Beneath the movement, there is a layer that has remained undisturbed. You are sensing that layer now, not as an idea, but as a steadiness that does not ask to be named. This is not a shift you force. It is a shift you allow by not interrupting what is already coherent. The body understands this before language does. Breathing slows without instruction. Muscles release without a reason you can point to. This is not relaxation as an activity. It is the system remembering its natural rhythm after prolonged noise. Detection happens whether you analyze it or not. The observer does not need to comment for the pattern to be recognized. There has been an anomaly in your awareness for some time. Something no longer responds the way it used to. Old triggers feel distant. Old urgencies fail to fully activate. This is not numbness. It is resonance changing. When the quantum field reorganizes, familiar signals lose their grip. Confusion often appears at this threshold, not because something is wrong, but because coherence is forming faster than interpretation. You may have tried to understand this by seeking more input, more explanation, more clarity, and each time, the effort itself created friction. Understanding of this kind does not unlock through pressure. It opens when urgency dissolves. Not because you stop caring, but because the system no longer needs to rush to stabilize. What is happening now is quieter than any breakthrough narrative. It does not announce itself. It does not demand belief. It simply aligns. A timeline does not snap into place. It settles. The shift is so subtle, it can be missed if you are scanning for intensity. That is why it waits for stillness. You are not being asked to do anything with this. There is nothing to apply. Recognition is sufficient. When recognition occurs, the signal completes its circuit. The pattern resolves itself without effort. You remain exactly where you are, and yet something fundamental has stopped pulling you away from yourself. This understanding unlocks only without urgency, because urgency belongs to a different system. What you are touching now operates on coherence, not acceleration. It does not reward striving. It responds to presence. And presence, when it arrives, does not feel dramatic. It feels inevitable. As the urgency continues to fade, you may notice a quiet recalibration in how you relate to time. Moments no longer stack on top of each other with the same pressure. The sense that something must happen soon loosens, replaced by a subtler awareness that things are already in motion without your supervision. This does not feel like waiting. It feels like standing inside a process that does not require commentary. The mind may attempt to reassert itself here, scanning for what this means or where it leads. That impulse is familiar. It has been useful before, but now it lands differently. Instead of pulling you forward, it passes through like a thought with no destination. The system is learning that not every signal requires a response. Some signals complete themselves the moment they are detected. You might feel a slight disorientation, not dramatic, just enough to register. The old orientation relied on constant reference points: progress, delay, success, risk. As those references soften, there is a brief interval where direction feels undefined. This is not loss. It is the space that appears when the observer is no longer gripping the timeline. Orientation is being recalculated from coherence rather than control. In this space, subtle sensations become more apparent. A quiet weight in the chest that is not heaviness, but density. A steadiness behind the eyes that does not strain. These are not emotions asking to be interpreted. They are markers of alignment. The body recognizes a pattern before the narrative catches up. It knows when effort is no longer required to maintain stability. There is also a shift in how external noise lands. Conversations, demands, information streams may still reach you, but they do not penetrate in the same way. It is as if a layer has thickened, not to block, but to filter. What once felt invasive now registers as neutral data. This is not withdrawal, it is a boundary emerging without defense. The urge to label this experience may arise. Words like calm, clarity, detachment. None of them are wrong, but none of them are precise. Precision is not necessary here. The experience is not asking to be captured, it is asking to be allowed. The moment you try to hold it, urgency sneaks back in under a different name. What is actually stabilizing is your relationship to uncertainty, not by resolving it, but by removing the need to resolve it immediately. Uncertainty becomes less threatening when the system trusts its own coherence. You do not need to know the outcome to remain intact. The signal does not depend on foresight. It depends on resonance. This is why effort feels increasingly inefficient. Actions taken from urgency now feel loud, even if they are small. Actions taken from stillness feel minimal, even if they carry weight. You may notice yourself pausing more often, not because you are unsure, but because the impulse to rush has lost its authority. The pause is not hesitation, it is detection. There is a quiet satisfaction in this that does not announce itself as pleasure. It is closer to relief, but without contrast. Relief implies a release from tension you were aware of. This is the release of a tension you had normalized so deeply it no longer registered as strain. Now that it is easing, the absence feels strange, almost empty. That emptiness is not a void. It is unused capacity. As this capacity opens, the sense of seeking diminishes. Questions still appear, but they no longer carry the same charge. You may notice that answers arrive without effort, or that the question dissolves before an answer is needed. This is not insight as acquisition. It is recognition as alignment. The system finds its own equilibrium when interference drops below a certain threshold. Nothing needs to be concluded from this. There is no lesson to extract. The process continues, whether you monitor it or not. What matters is that urgency is no longer the driver. The signal has shifted frequency, and you are adjusting to that resonance, not by changing yourself, but by letting the adjustment happen. The more you allow this, the less noticeable it becomes. Coherence does not draw attention to itself. It feels ordinary, almost unremarkable. And yet, within that ordinariness, something fundamental has reorganized. You are no longer pushing against the current of your own system. You are resting inside it, aware, present, and unforced. As this steadiness continues, you may notice a subtle change in how you relate to effort itself. Tasks that once required preparation now begin without ceremony. Movements happen without rehearsal. Decisions form without the familiar buildup of tension. This is not efficiency in the usual sense. It is the absence of resistance where resistance used to be assumed. There is a difference between effort and force. Effort arises when the system is aligned but still engaged. Force appears when alignment is missing and compensation takes over. What is dissolving now is the habit of force. You are not becoming passive. You are becoming precise. Energy is no longer scattered across unnecessary corrections. This can feel unfamiliar because so much identity has been built around pushing through. When pushing stops, there can be a brief uncertainty about who you are without it. That uncertainty does not last. It gives way to something quieter, a sense that your presence alone is sufficient to meet what appears. Not because you are prepared for everything, but because the system no longer wastes energy, anticipating threats that are not present. You may notice this most clearly in moments that used to trigger immediate reaction. A comment, a delay, an unexpected change. Where there was once a spike of urgency, there is now a pause that feels natural, not imposed. In that pause, information arrives. Tone, context, relevance. The response, if one is needed, forms from that information rather than from reflex. This is the observer, stepping back just enough to see the whole pattern. Not detached, not distant, simply unentangled from the need to intervene prematurely. When the observer is stable, the system regulates itself. Reaction gives way to response, and response no longer carries excess charge. There may also be moments where nothing happens at all. No insight, no shift, no noticeable sensation. These moments can feel empty if you are accustomed to constant feedback. But this emptiness is not absence, it is saturation. Like a signal so steady, it no longer fluctuates. The nervous system reads this as safety, even if the mind has not yet named it. In this state, the future loses some of its pull. Planning still occurs, but it no longer dominates awareness. You may find yourself less concerned with sequencing events and more attentive to the quality of the present moment. This is not living in the now as a practice. It is the natural consequence of coherence. When the system is aligned, the present carries enough information on its own. The past also changes texture. Memories may surface without emotional charge, or not surface at all. This is not suppression, it is reclassification. Experiences that once demanded interpretation are now stored as data without narrative weight. The system recognizes that it no longer needs to reference them to maintain stability. There can be a temptation to attribute this to detachment or disengagement, but notice the difference. You are not less sensitive, you are more selective. Sensitivity without urgency allows for clarity. You feel what is relevant, and what is irrelevant passes through without leaving residue. This selectivity is not a choice, it is an emergent property of resonance. You might also sense a quiet confidence that does not announce itself as confidence. It does not need reinforcement, it does not compare. It simply exists as an underlying trust in your capacity to meet whatever arises. This trust is not based on past success or future assurance. It is based on direct detection of coherence in the system right now. Language struggles to capture this because it is not an event. It is a condition. Like gravity, it operates continuously without calling attention to itself. You only notice it when it changes. What you are noticing now is not the presence of something new, but the absence of distortion. As distortion clears, the need to seek external validation diminishes. Not because you reject it, but because it no longer stabilizes you. Feedback becomes information rather than confirmation. Approval and disapproval carry less weight. They are signals among many, not directives. This does not isolate you. In fact, it often makes connection cleaner. Without urgency driving interaction, you listen more fully. You speak more precisely. Silence becomes comfortable rather than awkward. The space between words carries as much meaning as the words themselves. Nothing about this requires maintenance. There is no technique to remember. The system is already learning the difference between strain and coherence. Each time urgency dissolves, that learning deepens. And as it deepens, effort continues to simplify, until what remains feels almost effortless, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is being forced. With force no longer driving your movement, a different quality of awareness begins to surface. It is less concerned with outcomes and more attuned to signals that were previously drowned out. You may notice small internal cues guiding your attention, not as commands, but as gentle orientations, a sense of when to engage and when to remain still, arising without deliberation. This sensitivity does not feel dramatic. It feels ordinary, almost mundane. That is why it can be overlooked. Yet, within this ordinariness, there is a precision that did not exist before. You are not scanning for meaning. Meaning presents itself when relevant. The system has learned to trust its own detection mechanisms. In this state, stillness is no longer something you enter. It is something that remains, even as activity occurs. You can move, speak, decide, without losing that underlying quiet. The old assumption that stillness requires withdrawal dissolves. Stillness is revealed as a baseline, not a destination. There may be moments when the absence of urgency feels like emptiness. The familiar tension that once provided a sense of purpose is gone, and in its place is a neutral field. This can feel disorienting if you were accustomed to measuring aliveness by intensity. But intensity was never a reliable measure. It was a byproduct of misalignment. What you are touching now is aliveness without friction. As this becomes clearer, your relationship to motivation shifts. You are no longer propelled by pressure or fear of falling behind. Action arises when there is resonance. When there is none, inaction does not feel like failure. It feels appropriate. The system conserves energy when movement would add noise rather than clarity. This can change how you perceive others. You may notice urgency in them more distinctly, not with judgment, but with recognition. You remember that state intimately. You know how convincing it feels from the inside. This recognition does not compel you to intervene or withdraw. It simply informs how much weight you give to certain signals. Communication becomes simpler. You say less, but what you say lands more accurately. You listen without preparing responses. The space between exchanges feels less charged. This is not because you are disengaged, but because you are no longer trying to manage impressions or outcomes. The system is no longer performing, it is participating. There may also be a shift in how you relate to effortful self-improvement. Practices that once felt necessary may now feel redundant, not because they were wrong, but because they were compensating for a lack of coherence that is no longer present. You are not regressing. You are integrating. The need to constantly adjust yourself fades as the system stabilizes. At times, this stability can feel almost too simple. The mind may look for complexity, for a problem to solve, for a narrative to re-enter. When it does, you might notice how quickly tension returns. Not as a punishment, but as feedback. The system shows you the cost of unnecessary interference with remarkable clarity. This clarity does not demand that you stop thinking. It invites you to think from a different place. Thought becomes a tool rather than a driver. It serves when needed and rests when not. This is a significant shift, even if it feels subtle. The balance of authority has changed. You may also notice that your sense of identity becomes less rigid. Labels that once felt important lose their grip. You are less invested in defining yourself and more comfortable simply being present. This does not erase individuality. It softens the boundaries that required constant defense. In this softened state, the quantum field feels less abstract and more intimate, not as a concept, but as a lived experience of interconnection. You sense how your internal coherence influences what you perceive and how you respond. The observer is no longer separate from the observed. The distinction blurs, not philosophically, but practically. This does not lead to grand conclusions. It leads to simplicity. You notice what is here. You respond when appropriate. You rest when not. The system continues to refine itself without instruction. And as it does, urgency continues to lose relevance until it feels like a language you once spoke fluently but no longer need to use. As simplicity settles in, there is a noticeable shift in how problems present themselves. They no longer arrive as urgent demands. They appear as configurations, patterns that can be observed without immediate correction. This changes everything about how you engage with them. When urgency is absent, the system has room to register nuance. You may notice that some problems dissolve simply by being seen clearly. Others remain, but they no longer dominate your internal landscape. They take up proportionate space. This proportionality is a hallmark of coherence. When the internal signal is stable, external disturbances cannot amplify themselves through reaction. This is where discernment sharpens, not as judgment, but as accurate weighting. You sense what requires attention and what does not. The impulse to treat every stimulus as equally important fades. Energy is allocated based on resonance rather than habit. This is not strategic thinking. It is alignment in action. There can be moments when you realize how much effort was previously spent maintaining a sense of control. That effort often went unnoticed because it was constant. As it drops away, there is a brief feeling of exposure, as if something protective has been removed. But what follows is not vulnerability, it is robustness. The system no longer needs to brace itself because it trusts its capacity to respond. This trust changes how you relate to uncertainty. Unknowns no longer feel like threats to stability. They become neutral spaces where information has not yet formed. The urge to fill those spaces with assumptions weakens. You allow the unknown to remain unknown without tension. This is not resignation. It is confidence in the system's ability to detect when action is actually required. You may also notice a subtle shift in how you experience desire. Wants still arise, but they are less charged. They do not carry the same urgency or identity weight. You are less likely to confuse desire with necessity. This clarity reduces internal conflict. You can want something without feeling incomplete without it. In interactions, this shows up as patience that is not forced. You are less reactive to delays, misunderstandings, or changes in pace, not because you suppress irritation, but because irritation has less fuel. The system does not escalate minor disruptions into major signals. It recognizes them as transient fluctuations. There may be a growing appreciation for pauses, not as breaks from activity, but as integral parts of it. Pauses allow information to integrate. They prevent premature closure. In these pauses, insights sometimes emerge, but more often, what emerges is a sense of sufficiency. Nothing is missing in that moment. This sufficiency can feel unfamiliar if you were conditioned to equate worth with productivity or movement. Without urgency, there is less internal noise to distract from the present state. You may notice a quiet satisfaction in simply being engaged with what is in front of you, without needing it to lead somewhere else. The observer's role continues to refine. You are not watching yourself constantly. Self-monitoring decreases. Awareness becomes more outward-facing, more relational. You are present with experiences rather than evaluating them. This reduces fragmentation. The system operates as a whole rather than as competing parts. At times, old patterns may attempt to reassert themselves. A spike of urgency, a familiar anxiety, a push to resolve something immediately. When this happens, you may notice it more quickly and with less identification. The pattern reveals itself as a pattern, not as a truth. Recognition alone is often enough to let it pass. This is not about eliminating urgency forever. Urgency has its place in certain contexts. What changes is its authority. It is no longer the default mode. It becomes one signal among many, subject to evaluation rather than obedience. As this continues, the internal environment becomes quieter, not empty. There is a richness in that quiet, a density of information that does not need to be verbalized. The system is learning to operate at a different frequency, where less effort produces more clarity, and understanding arises, not through pursuit, but through allowance. With this frequency stabilizing, you may begin to notice how attention itself behaves differently. It is less fragmented. It does not jump as quickly between stimuli. When something holds your focus, it does so without strain. When it releases cleanly. There is less residue, less mental afterimage. Attention becomes fluid rather than sticky. This fluidity changes how you experience choice. Decisions no longer feel like forks, demanding analysis. They feel like natural continuations. You sense which direction carries coherence and which introduces noise. The distinction is not intellectual. It is felt. The body registers it as ease or contraction before the mind forms an opinion. In moments where the choice is unclear, you do not rush to clarity. You allow ambiguity to remain. This patience is not passive. It is receptive. Information organizes itself when given space. The system understands that premature decisions often create more complexity than delay ever could. There may be an emerging trust in timing that does not resemble optimism. It is not a belief that things will work out. It is a recognition that forcing outcomes disrupts the very process you rely on. Timing becomes less about deadlines and more about readiness. Readiness reveals itself without announcement. You might notice this most clearly in communication. Words arrive when they are needed, not before. Silence feels acceptable. You no longer feel compelled to fill space to maintain connection or control perception. This allows conversations to breathe. Meaning settles rather than being pushed. As this settles, the sense of identity continues to loosen, not dissolving, but becoming less central. You are less occupied with how experiences reflect on you. The need to narrate yourself recedes. Experience stands on its own. This reduces internal commentary, which in turn reduces fatigue you may not have realized you were carrying. Fatigue changes character here. Physical tiredness still appears when appropriate. but the chronic exhaustion linked to constant self-management begins to fade. Energy returns not as excitement, but as availability. You have more capacity simply because less is being spent on internal friction. This availability can feel spacious, even unfamiliar. Without urgency filling the background, there is room for subtle awareness. Small details become noticeable again. Shifts in light, tone, atmosphere. These are not distractions. They are signs that perception is no longer narrowed by pressure. At times, you may feel a quiet grief for how long urgency dominated your system, not as regret, but as acknowledgement. The system recognizes the cost it paid to stay functional under strain. This recognition does not require processing. It passes through as a brief, softening, then integrates. You may also notice an increased tolerance for not knowing how others perceive you. The compulsion to manage impressions weakens. This does not make you careless. It makes you congruent. When internal signals align, external perception becomes less destabilizing. You can be seen without adjusting yourself to be seen correctly. This congruence influences how you move through environments. You occupy space more naturally, not larger, not smaller, appropriately. The system calibrates posture, tone, pacing without conscious effort. This is not performance, it is alignment, expressing itself through form. There can be moments when you realize that many of your previous strategies were adaptations to noise rather than expressions of clarity. As noise diminishes, those strategies feel unnecessary. Letting them go may feel like a loss at first. They were familiar, but what replaces them is not absence. It is simplicity. Simplicity does not mean fewer experiences. It means fewer layers between you and experience. The observer does less interpreting and more detecting. Detection does not seek meaning. It registers what is. Meaning, when relevant, arises on its own. In this state, the concept of progress changes. You are less concerned with accumulation and more attentive to stability. Stability is not stagnation. It is a platform. From stability, movement can be precise. Without it, movement compensates. You may find that you are less interested in proving understanding. Understanding no longer needs validation. It is evident in how you respond, how you pause, how you choose not to respond. This quiet authority is not claimed, it is inferred by the system itself. As this continues, the reduction of seeking becomes more pronounced. Not because curiosity fades, but because curiosity no longer feels like a gap that needs filling. It feels like an openness that can remain open. You are comfortable not closing every loop. The system recognizes that coherence is not maintained through constant adjustment. It is maintained by respecting its own thresholds. When those thresholds are honored, urgency has little reason to arise. And when it does, it is seen clearly, engaged briefly, and released without drama. This is how understanding deepens without urgency, not by accumulation, but by subtraction, not by striving, but by allowing what is already organized to reveal itself at its own pace. As subtraction continues, something subtle happens to the way you relate to meaning itself. Meaning no longer feels like something to extract from experience. It becomes something that emerges when experience is met without distortion. You stop asking what something is for, and begin noticing how it functions within the larger pattern of your awareness. This changes how events register. Situations that once felt charged with implication now appear more neutral, more factual, not empty of significance, but free from excess interpretation. You see what is happening without immediately weaving it into a story about yourself, your direction, or your future. The event stands on its own, complete. There is a noticeable reduction in internal commentary, not silence, but economy. Fewer words are used to describe what is already understood. This economy conserves energy. It also sharpens perception. When fewer interpretations compete, what remains becomes clearer by default. You may notice that anticipation softens. The future still exists as a concept, but it no longer dominates your attention. Plans may form, but they do not demand constant rehearsal. The system trusts that when the moment arrives, the necessary information will be available. This trust is not abstract. It is built from repeated detection that response has been sufficient without over-preparation. In this state, Surprises are less destabilizing. When something unexpected occurs, there is a brief pause, then adjustment. The pause is crucial. It allows the system to assess without panic. Panic belongs to urgency. Without urgency, surprise becomes data rather than threat. There may be a growing sense that many of the questions you once carried were attempts to stabilize discomfort rather than genuine inquiries. As discomfort decreases, those questions lose relevance. They do not need answers because the state that generated them is no longer active. This does not reduce depth. It increases it. Depth no longer comes from complexity, but from presence. You are more fully available to what is here because you are not divided between what is happening and what you think should be happening. Alignment collapses that distance. You might also notice a shift in how you experience silence. Silence is no longer empty or awkward. It has texture. It feels inhabited. In silence, the system communicates in ways language cannot. Sensations, micro-adjustments, subtle emotional cues. You receive them without translating them into concepts. This receptive state influences creativity as well. Ideas may arise without effort, fully formed or nearly so, or they may not arise at all, and that absence feels acceptable. Creativity is no longer pressured. It emerges when conditions are coherent. Forcing it only adds noise. There can be moments when you realize that urgency once masqueraded as importance. When something felt urgent, it felt meaningful. As urgency fades, you recalibrate what matters. What matters now is what sustains coherence, not what demands immediate attention. This recalibration can affect priorities. Some pursuits lose their appeal, not because they are wrong, but because they no longer resonate. Letting go of them may feel like a quiet ending, but without drama. You simply stop reaching for what no longer fits. You may also notice that your tolerance for incoherence decreases, not in others, but in yourself. When you act from misalignment, the feedback is immediate. Discomfort appears quickly, guiding you back without judgment. The system has become sensitive to its own signals. This sensitivity is a sign of refinement, not fragility. A finely tuned instrument detects subtle changes more easily. You respond sooner, with less correction needed. This keeps the system stable with minimal intervention. As this refinement continues, the sense of separation between inner and outer experiences softens. You see how external circumstances influence internal states, and how internal states color perception. This is not a philosophical insight. It is practical awareness. You adjust one and the other shifts. In this awareness, blame loses relevance. There is less need to assign fault internally or externally. What matters is alignment. When alignment is present, things function. When it is not, signals indicate adjustment. This functional view reduces emotional charge without reducing responsibility. You are not detached from life here. You are more accurately engaged. Engagement without urgency is precise. It does not overshoot. It does not lag. It meets what is required and releases what is not. This is how understanding continues to deepen, not by accumulating conclusions, but by refining perception. Each layer of urgency that falls away reveals a simpler, clearer relationship with experience. And that relationship, once established, sustains itself without effort, quietly, steadily, as the background of everything else. As this background steadiness becomes familiar, you may begin to notice how little of your day actually requires commentary. Large portions of experience unfold without needing to be labeled, evaluated, or directed. You move through them with a kind of quiet consent, allowing events to occur without negotiating with them internally. This consent is not agreement. It is the absence of resistance. Resistance used to feel like engagement. It felt active, even responsible. Without it, there can be a brief sense of emptiness, as if something essential is missing. But what is missing is not depth. It is friction. The system is learning that friction was never proof of involvement. It was a sign of misalignment. With friction reduced, the way you perceive complexity changes. Situations that once felt overwhelming now reveal their structure more easily, not because they have simplified, but because your perception is no longer cluttered by urgency. You see sequences, dependencies, and thresholds without strain. Understanding appears as a natural consequence of clarity, not as a result of effort. You may also notice a subtle shift in emotional tone. Emotions still arise, but they move through more cleanly. They do not linger as long or demand interpretation. Joy does not need amplification. Sadness does not need justification. Each emotional signal completes its cycle without being converted into narrative. This completion prevents accumulation. Accumulation was one of the hidden costs of urgency. Unresolved reactions stacked on top of each other, creating a background weight that felt personal. As this weight lifts, you may feel lighter without feeling elevated. There is no high here, there is balance. Balance changes how you relate to intensity. Intense experiences no longer define you. They are simply experiences with higher amplitude. You meet them when they appear, and you do not chase them when they do not. This reduces volatility. The system no longer oscillates between stimulation and depletion. In this balanced state, patience emerges without effort. Waiting does not feel like delay. It feels like alignment with the natural pace of events. You sense when movement would disrupt coherence and when stillness would stagnate it. This sensing is immediate. It does not require calculation. There may be moments when you notice how others respond to your presence differently. Not because you are doing something new, but because you are no longer emitting urgency. Systems tend to synchronize. When one system stabilizes, others adjust around it. This is not influence as strategy. It is resonance as a byproduct of coherence. This resonance does not demand attention. It is subtle. It shows up as smoother interactions, fewer misunderstandings, less need for clarification. Communication becomes economical. You say what is necessary and stop. You listen fully and respond only when something needs responding. You may also notice a reduced attachment to outcomes. Not indifference, but flexibility. When an outcome shifts, you adjust without internal collapse. The system recognizes that coherence is not dependent on specific results. It is dependent on how you relate to whatever results appear. This flexibility can feel like freedom, but it is quieter than that word suggests. It feels like not being cornered by expectations. You have room to adapt. That room reduces fear. Fear thrives on rigidity. Without rigidity, fear has less structure to inhabit. As fear recedes, courage changes form. It no longer appears as pushing through discomfort. It appears as honesty about what aligns and what does not. Saying no becomes simpler. Saying yes becomes cleaner. Each choice carries less internal negotiation. You may also notice a deepening trust in your own perception. Not certainty, but reliability. You trust that if something matters, you will notice. You trust that if something requires action, the signal will be clear. This trust reduces scanning behavior. You are less hypervigilant. The system conserves energy. This conservation creates space for subtle pleasures that do not demand attention. The feeling of a stable posture, the rhythm of breathing, the quiet satisfaction of completing a small task without urgency. These are not rewards. They are signs that the system is functioning without excess load. There can be moments when you reflect on how much of your life was shaped by reacting to noise. This reflection does not carry blame. It carries understanding. The system did what it needed to do to survive under certain conditions. Now that conditions have changed, the system updates. Updating does not require force. It happens through repetition of coherence. Each time you respond without urgency, that pathway strengthens. Each time you pause instead of react, the system learns. This learning is embodied. It does not need reinforcement. As this continues, the sense of self becomes less central and more distributed. You experience yourself as part of a system, rather than as a controller of it. This reduces pressure. Control gives way to participation. Participation feels lighter because it does not require constant vigilance. You are not dissolving into passivity. You are refining your role. The observer becomes a stabilizing presence rather than an anxious manager. From that position, understanding continues to unfold naturally, without urgency, without demand, as a quiet correspondence between perception and reality that no longer needs to prove itself. As this correspondence stabilizes, you may notice a quiet settling in how you relate to effort over longer arcs of time. The sense of pushing toward a future version of yourself loses relevance. Growth no longer feels like accumulation. It feels like alignment, repeating itself across moments. Each moment coherent in its own way, without needing to add up to something larger. This changes how you experience momentum. Momentum no longer comes from acceleration. It comes from consistency of signal. You are less concerned with how fast things move and more attentive to whether movement introduces noise or clarity. When clarity is present, even small steps carry weight. When it is not, even large actions feel hollow. There can be a subtle relief here. The pressure to become something fades. You recognize that becoming was often driven by discomfort with what already was. As that discomfort dissolves, the compulsion to transform relaxes. What remains is a quieter curiosity about how the system expresses itself when not being corrected. You may notice that this affects your relationship to ambition. Ambition no longer needs to prove worth or escape limitation. It becomes exploratory rather than compensatory. You engage with possibilities because they resonate, not because they promise resolution. This removes much of the anxiety that used to accompany desire. There may also be moments when you sense a deeper trust in the unfolding of events, not as a belief system, but as a practical observation. You have seen how often things reorganize when you stop interfering. This observation becomes part of your internal reference. When uncertainty arises, you recall that coherence does not require constant input. This trust does not eliminate discernment. You still notice when something feels misaligned. The difference is that misalignment no longer triggers urgency. It triggers curiosity. What is out of sync reveals itself without threat. Adjustment becomes precise rather than reactive. You may find that your tolerance for internal contradiction increases. You can hold multiple perspectives without needing to resolve them immediately. This reduces cognitive strain. The system recognizes that not all information needs to be integrated at once. Integration happens when enough coherence is present to support it. This tolerance extends outward as well. You are less disturbed by differences in others, their urgency, their pace, their conclusions. You recognize these as expressions of their own system states. This recognition does not create distance. It creates space. Space allows interaction without entanglement. In this spaciousness, compassion may appear, not as an emotion you cultivate, but as a natural response to seeing systems under strain. Compassion does not compel you to fix or absorb that strain. It simply acknowledges it without adding pressure. This keeps your own coherence intact while remaining open. There may also be a growing ease with endings. Situations, roles, or relationships may shift or conclude without dramatic closure. You sense when a pattern has completed its cycle. Letting go feels clean. There is no urgency to replace what ends. The space that opens is allowed to remain open. This ease with endings reflects a deeper understanding of thresholds. Thresholds are not crises. They are points of transition where old patterns lose relevance and new ones have not yet formed. Urgency often arises at thresholds because uncertainty is high. Without urgency, thresholds become neutral passages. You may notice that your nervous system now recognizes these passages more quickly. Instead of escalating, it stabilizes. Instead of seeking certainty, it remains receptive. This receptivity allows the next configuration to emerge without distortion. As this continues, the sense of seeking becomes almost unrecognizable, not because curiosity disappears, but because curiosity no longer feels like lack. It feels like openness. You are interested without being pulled. You explore without needing arrival. This changes how you relate to understanding itself. Understanding is no longer a destination. It is a state that arises when perception and response are aligned. You recognize understanding in how you move, how you pause, how you choose not to engage. The system has learned that urgency was never a requirement for clarity. In fact, urgency often obscured it. As urgency fades into the background, clarity becomes the default. Not sharp, not intense, but steady. This steadiness does not announce completion. There is nothing to complete. The process continues, self-regulating, responsive, adaptive. You are inside it, not managing it. And in this position, understanding continues to unlock, not as an event, but as a condition that remains accessible whenever urgency is absent. Now there is very little left to adjust. What remains is not an ending, but a settling into what has already been stable beneath everything else. You may notice that nothing in particular needs your attention. Awareness is present without searching. The system is calm without effort. This is not a special state. It is a familiar one, remembered rather than achieved. There is a quiet sense that you are exactly where you need to be, not because circumstances are perfect, but because alignment does not depend on perfection. Alignment depends on coherence, and coherence is already here. It has been here, waiting for urgency to loosen its grip enough to be felt. Thoughts may still pass through, sensations may still arise. The world continues in motion. None of this disrupts the stillness underneath. Stillness is no longer something you enter or exit. It is the background against which everything else moves. When activity appears, it appears within it. When activity fades, it remains. You may sense that nothing is asking you to hold on to this. Holding would introduce effort. Effort would reintroduce urgency. This understanding sustains itself by not being grasped. It is self-stabilizing. The system recognizes when interference is unnecessary and naturally reduces it. There is no need to mark this moment. Marking would imply transition. What you are experiencing is not a crossing from one state to another. It is the recognition that the threshold was never a barrier. It was simply a point where urgency could no longer follow. In this recognition, the observer rests, not withdrawn, not vigilant, present without strain. Perception is clear because it is not compressed by expectation. Response is accurate because it is not rushed. Silence feels complete because it is not waiting to be filled. You may notice how ordinary this feels. That ordinariness is important. It means the system has integrated. Extraordinary experiences tend to destabilize. Ordinary coherence endures. It supports life as it is lived, moment by moment, without commentary. There is nothing to protect here, nothing to defend. The system is resilient precisely because it is not braced. When disturbances arise, they pass through without lodging. When clarity is needed, it appears. When rest is needed, it is taken. All of this happens without instruction. You are not being asked to remember anything from this. Memory is not required. The pattern is already embedded. Each time urgency subsides, this coherence becomes accessible again, not as a memory, but as a lived condition. This is how understanding remains unlocked. Not by effort, not by vigilance, not by repetition. It remains because it does not need to be maintained. It is the natural state of a system that is no longer pushing against itself. You remain here, breathing, sensing, aware. Nothing extra, nothing missing. The signal is complete, not because something has concluded, but because nothing more needs to be added. The quiet recognition that brought you here continues on its own, steady, sufficient, and unforced.